No disrespect to Mr. Smith here, but I believe that this demonstrates one of the most prominent human flaws that we have that continues to separate us every day. So, in response to my video where I said that why are African Americans running towards indigenous and are trying to hide from their African ancestry, not realizing the illustrious history that we have out of Africa, but that there is, and the main point was that there is absolutely nothing wrong with being both indigenous to America as well as African ancestry that came over during chattel slavery. Many people are against that. Many people don't like it for obvious reasons, but it is not something to be ashamed of. Every civilization has went through something similar to that. But this statement actually demonstrates something else that is a flaw in human nature, and that's why we have these issues. The flaw is that I already have a predetermined landing point, and I want to formulate a mindset that only supports my predetermined landing point, and I refuse to do research, and I will make statements. Let me not say refuse to do research, but I haven't done research, and I will make statements that actually don't make sense when you can simply think through it with critical thinking. So let's look at some of the things, what he's saying, what Mr. Sherman is saying here, Sherman Smith. He said, I don't believe it's shame. They're connecting dots that don't make sense, at least to me. Now, he said they're connecting dots that don't make sense, which is some of the rhetoric that you'll hear when you listen to some of these people who talk about we're indigenous to America. They will only give you the historical information or the scientific information that fits their narrative and not give you all sides of the argument. But this is the part that you should have been able to logically think through without having to listen to anyone or do any Google searches or research or anything of that nature. If you've been through formal education up through high school, this portion of your statement, you should have automatically known there was something amiss here, which demonstrates you are headed towards a landing point and will accept whatever makes sense to get to that landing point. Or if I'm wrong, my apologies that you didn't learn these things. But he said that it never made sense that foreigners from a different landmass go into a foreign landmass that they are not familiar with. Let's think about this now. Nations rise, nations fall, nations conquer. The Mali Empire conquered all across North Africa. The Songhai, the Ashanti, the Dahomey, these were powerful African nations that continue to conquer land after land after land. Now you're going to say, well, they conquered within their own continent. The Mongols conquered from Asia almost into Europe. Different Europeans conquered all throughout Europe. The Romans conquered lands in the Levant, in Europe, and in Africa. So did the Greeks. The Aztecs, the Mayans conquered all throughout the Mesoamerica and South America. People have migrated from landmasses to landmasses without being familiar with them throughout the time frame of human history. You would have to deny migration in order to accept that people went from different landmasses to go into a foreign landmass that they're not familiar with. Then go to another landmass that they're not familiar with. So let's look at his whole statement. Then go to another landmass that they're not familiar with to bring foreign people to the same foreign landmass because of the indigenous people were dying of disease and conquest. Now, when we take his whole statement, what he's actually saying beyond people just migrating, people just conquering, that a people will go to a landmass that they're not familiar with. Well, we know we have explorers. We know we have conquerors. We know people do that, go to an unfamiliar land for resources or to conquer. Now, let's think about it, that they're familiar with. The transatlantic slave trade went initially from Africa to Europe. And African slaves were purchased by the Ottomans, they were purchased by Europeans. They initially went into Europe in and around 1450, around that time frame, a little bit earlier, 1430s. Go watch my video about how the papacy started the transatlantic slave trade. Then So understand, much prior to that, 50, 100 years prior, Europeans were already trading with North Africa. They were already trading with the beginning parts of West Africa, with the Canary Islands. They were already, prior to this time frame, taking the longer route around Africa to go to India. These lands weren't unfamiliar to them. The biggest difference is that not until the mid 1500s did they start establishing stable outposts, but they were familiar with the land and familiar with some of the people of the land. Were they familiar with the interior of the land? No, but the coastal portions of West Africa, they were familiar with and had been familiar with for a very long time. By the time we get the first slave ship that lands in America, North America, it is 1619. Almost 100 years have passed. Well, no, more than 100 years, almost 200 years have passed since the Pope Eugene IV truly authorized the transatlantic slave trade. So almost 200 years have passed for them them knowing and for being familiar with Africa. They have colonies now in Africa. So they were well established in Africa when the full transatlantic slave trade began. Let's look at it from another standpoint. Christopher Columbus, the asshole that he is, took four men who were from the Ivory Coast or Ghana, from Ghana, and they piloted his ships to the Caribbean, because I refuse to say to the Americas, to the Caribbean. This was 1492. This was 1492. From 1492, you start to have more Europeans start coming to America. So from let's just say 1500, you get the first slave in 1619. That's more than 100 years for the European to become familiar with North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean islands. So they weren't unfamiliar. And that was more than enough time to watch the indigenous people die off in droves because they were they were not vaccinated, basically. They didn't go through a natural vaccination of diseases like smallpox and the Black Plague. Let's think about it. The Black Plague supposedly killed 70 to 90% of Europeans. For those who survived, they developed a natural immunity to the Black Plague, to the bubonic plague. They also realized how important hygiene was that they were taught by the Moors. But they have now, as every child is born, just like how we are today, you are born with natural immunity to things that your ancestors had to face down. The indigenous people in the Americas never dealt with smallpox. They never dealt with the bubonic plague. So yes, the Europeans for 100 years before importing African slaves had wiped out their competition for the land because they weren't prepared for these diseases. Now, but for the previous 100 to 200 years, the European had been interacting with Africans. So to a certain extent, Africans had developed an immunity to the majority of European diseases. So therefore, it made more sense for them to utilize African slaves in the Americas because they wouldn't die of the diseases that the Europeans had and that the indigenous people died off of. You have a similar situation between India and Africa. The Europeans actually went to India and moved slaves from India to Africa. That's a whole nother story. So let's think deeper about these situations before we come to a conclusion, so that each time we land at a spot that has been validated by critical thinking. So as always, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations. And don't forget to like, share the video. Your support is greatly appreciated, and continue to follow the pages, because as I said, we're building a community and it's for all of us to learn and to grow. So thank you very kindly.